stone faces turned inland, as if watching over a vanished world. The first thing that grabs you is scale, nearly 1,000 carved figures some over 10 meters tall, and weighing many tons scattered across an island no larger than a small county. That number and their ubiquity matter because they force an immediate question: who built these things? And why would people invest so much labor and skill to move mountains of rock across a tiny remote island? The answer begins with the Rapa Nui, the Polynesian people who colonized a speck of land in the middle of the Pacific and over centuries created an astonishing ritual landscape centered on ancestry status and a visible claim to land and power. Archaeologists estimate the Moai were carved and erected between roughly the 10th and 16th centuries, a period when the island's population and social complexity grew enough to mobilize communal labor for large projects. Those figures and dates ground the story. They are not myths. They come from field surveys, radiocarbon dating, and long-term study of the island's archaeology. What the Moai represent is layered. On the surface, they are human-like monoliths carved from volcanic tuff at the quarry of Rapanui, each one a stylized portrait of an ancestor or an important leader. But beneath that visible face, there are politics, religion, and resource allocation. The placement of a statue on a ceremonial platform or ahu signaled the status and authority of clan. Building and transporting a statue was a public performance, a way to display social cohesion and technological know-how. The sheer number of partially finished statues left in the quarry and along ancient roads tells a complex story. Not all projects were completed, and some processes were abandoned mid-course, leaving tangible evidence of changing social priorities. This evidence has been central to long debates about whether the Moai projects helped precipitate environmental strain on the island, or whether the narrative of self-inflicted collapse oversimplifies what really happened. When we ask when the island changed, the timeline is crucial. The peak period of Moai production and erection appears to coincide with a time of active resource use, more trees cut for agricultural fields, for canoe building, and critically for moving statues, if one subscribes to older models that required logs and heavy labor. By around the 16th century, multiple lines of paleoecological evidence showed dramatic reductions in tree cover and shifts in species composition, which altered soils and food production. Scholars, including paleobotanists and archaeologists, have read those environmental signals as evidence that human activity had a profound impact on the island's ecosystem. That case was famously popularized as a cautionary story of ecological overshoot, where monumental construction and competition helped trigger social stress. But the shape of that argument has changed as new data and fresh interpretations have arrived. Where the Moai sit on the landscape is itself a kind of argument. Most face inland, looking over fields and villages, their backs to the sea. That orientation suggests the gaze of ancestors protecting or legitimizing land use rather than a maritime orientation. Recent work has also found statistical links between statue placement and practical landscape features, such as freshwater sources. Statues were often positioned in areas with better access to water and arable land, which reframes the Moai as part of a broader strategy to mark and manage the most valuable resources on a small island. This is not just poetic interpretation, it is spatial analysis of statue locations combined with environmental mapping, which yields a clear pattern to the Moai map on a lifeline's places where people grew crops, accessed water, and organized their communities. Those patterns nudge us away from seeing the Moai solely as ego projects, and towards seeing them as elements of a living social ecology. How practically were these massive stones carved and moved? That's where imagination meets experiment. The primary quarry at Rapanui provided workable volcanic tuff that sculptors shaped with basalt picks. But transport was the real puzzle. For decades, the standard image was of giant teams felling trees to make rollers and sledges hauling statues horizontally toward platforms. That model tied statue transport to deforestation and thus to environmental explanations for social change. Beginning in the late 20th and early 21st centuries, however, researchers began proposing alternatives supported by experiments and careful study of statue shapes and ancient roads. One influential set of experiments and models proposed that the Moai could be walked upright by rocking and pivoting with ropes, a technique that dramatically reduces the need for timber and for enormous labor forces. This walking hypothesis was demonstrated in controlled trials and argued to fit physical and archaeological constraints, offering a way that statues could be moved without the catastrophic level of tree felling once assumed. The debate is not closed, but the walking idea has shifted how scholars imagine the combination of technology, ritual, and labor on the island. If we break the island's history into parts, the early centuries after colonization were a time of adaptation and growth. The Rapanui learned to cultivate sweet potato and to exploit seabirds and marine resources, and they developed social institutions that could channel labor into public works. Over generations, those institutions produced a cultural logic where ancestor images on Ahu were central to property, ritual, and identity. Moai building was never merely engineering, it was a cultural act that embedded meaning in stone. When social competition or ritual urgency increased, so too did the desire to create bigger, more imposing statues of visible language of rank and piety. This internal dynamism explains why Moai projects could flourish even on a small island. Who did the carving and the hauling? This is where archaeology moves from broad strokes to human stories. The evidence points to clan-based labor organized around chiefs and ritual specialists. Ethnographic parallels in Polynesia, the distribution of tools, and the physical remains of roads and platforms all suggest coordinated communal efforts. Oral traditions preserved by Rapanui people also speak to the significance of ancestors and the sacred nature of the statues. Recent scholarship emphasizes the agency of islanders. They were not passive victims of environmental fate, but active actors innovating within constraints, making strategic choices about farming settlement and monument making that responded to changing conditions. That human-centered view complicates older narratives that portrayed the society as simple or doomed. What drove changes in social life? Conflict, resource scarcity, external contacts, disease brought by Europeans, or some combination, remains a contested question. European contact in the 18th and 19th centuries introduced new pressures, diseases, slave raids, and religious disruption significantly reduced the population and altered traditional practices. Those later shocks overlay earlier environmental and social dynamics, making it hard to untangle cause and effect. Newer research also shows that the island was not as isolated as once believed. Voyaging and cultural exchange with other Polynesian islands may have continued and influenced local practices, meaning Rapanui history is part of a larger Pacific web. As a result, collapses are no longer read purely as internal ecological failure, but as sequences of events including external contact, changing trade, and social adaptations. When we look at the Moai today, we must also confront the present. The statues are living heritage for the Rapanui people and a focal point of tourism and global curiosity. Yet they face new threats. Climate change and coastal erosion place some Ahu and statues at risk from rising seas and storm surges. Recent modeling warns that well-known sites could experience flooding hazards within decades unless mitigation and careful stewardship are implemented. UNESCO and local communities now work together on conservation plans that balance tourism, cultural rights, and scientific research. That modern dimension is a reminder that the story of the Moai is not sealed in the past. It intersects with contemporary debates about heritage, climate, and indigenous stewardship of ancestral places. How should we read the Moai as a lesson for our time? There is a temptation to turn Rapa Nui into a morality tale, build big, exhaust resources, and watch society unravel. That neat story has rhetorical power, but the archaeological record resists such simplicity. The deeper lesson is about complexity. Monumental projects can be expressions of social creativity and meaning, and they can coexist with ecological ingenuity and resilience. Equally, cultural change can be rapid when external shocks arrive. The Moai thus ask us to think about scale and contingency. Human societies make choices within limits, and those choices have consequences that unfold over long rhythms of generations. The statues remain an invitation to learn how communities organize labor, how ritual ideas shape landscapes, and how the past keeps speaking into the present. Who speaks for the Moai now is an ethical question. The Rapa Nui people are the first interlocutors, and their perspectives on ancestry sovereignty and tourism increasingly shape conservation decisions. Archaeologists and policymakers now work more closely with indigenous voices to preserve not only stones, but living traditions. That shift matters because it reframes research from extraction to collaboration. In practice, this means co-designed research agendas, community-led tourism planning, and heritage management that respects cultural protocols. Such an approach recognizes the Moai as both scientific objects and sacred presences, a dual identity that modern stewardship must honor. What remains uncertain is also what keeps the field alive. The Moai resist final answers. New methods, remote sensing, refined radiocarbon, dating, biomechanical modeling, and collaborative anthropology continue to revise and enrich the picture. Some questions may never be fully resolved, and others will be reframed as new data turn up. That open-endedness is part of the attraction, a landscape of stone that invites scientists, storytellers, and the island's own custodians to puzzle together across time. The Moai persist because they are embodiments of memory, technique, and community. They anchor a difficult, beautiful human story that is still being told. Finally, why should the Moai matter to people beyond the island? They are a reminder that human creativity can shape and be shaped by the environment in ways both fragile and durable. The Moai are not just isolated curiosities. They are testaments to social imagination, technical problem solving, and the power of place. As climate and cultural change accelerate worldwide, those lessons about adaptive choices, shared labor, and respectful stewardship feel especially urgent. The stone faces watch on, and the questions they pose about who we are, what we value, and how we will manage our common world remain as relevant now as they were the day they were raised.